During dinner, my father slammed his hand on the table and shouted, "Either you give your room to your sister or get out of this house right now." The room went silent. Forks froze midair. My mother stared at her plate like the pattern suddenly mattered. My sister kept her eyes down, but the corner of her mouth twitched just enough to tell me she was waiting for the outcome. What no one said out loud was the part that mattered. I had paid for most of the house we were sitting in. Not a loan, not a favor. Real money. Nearly $1.5 million I had earned myself after years of building my business from nothing. I was 32 years old, financially independent, exhausted. And in that moment, something colder than anger settled in my chest. This was not about a bedroom. It was about control. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I folded my napkin, pushed my chair in, and stood up. I walked out without a single threat, without tears, without the kind of scene my father had clearly expected. By the next morning, I bought myself a house by the sea. And while I was unpacking boxes and sleeping through the night for the first time in months, my family was about to learn what happens when you push the wrong person too far. If you've ever been pushed aside by your own family, stay with me. This story doesn't end the way they thought it would. The air outside that night felt sharper than it should have. I remember the sound of the front door closing behind me, soft but final, and the way my hands stayed steady as I unlocked my car. I didn't sit there crying. I didn't scream. I just drove. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. Not numb. Clear. As if something heavy had finally been set down. I didn't go back that night. I didn't text. I didn't explain myself. I already knew that anything I said would be twisted into another argument about sacrifice and family, and how I was expected to bend. I had spent most of my life being reasonable. My name is Claire Morgan, and for 8 years I built a business that no one in my family took seriously until the numbers became too big to ignore. Long days, quiet risks, careful planning. No inheritance. No shortcuts. I learned early that independence was the only safety net that didn't disappear when someone decided you were inconvenient. I didn't move back in with my parents because I needed them. I moved back in because I believed them. 6 months earlier, my father had called me with an idea he framed as a solution for all of us. A new house, a fresh start, space for everyone under one roof. He talked about family unity like it was a favor he was offering me, not the other way around. My mother followed with emotion. They were getting older. The house felt empty. Wouldn't it be nice to live together again as adults with mutual respect? I hesitated. Not because I couldn't afford it, but because I understood how quickly boundaries blurred in families like mine. So I made one condition. I would contribute nearly $1.5 million toward the purchase, but I would have the master bedroom on the ground floor. Privacy. Autonomy, dignity. I didn't ask for control. I asked for space. My father agreed immediately. Too quickly, if I'm honest now. My mother smiled and said, "Of course." My sister said nothing at all. I told myself that silence meant acceptance. The paperwork was handled by my father. He insisted on it. He always liked to feel in charge of things that mattered, and at the time, I let him. Blood felt safer than contracts. That was my mistake. Moving day was quiet in a way that felt rehearsed. Boxes lined the hallway. The house was large, modern, expensive, and somehow already cold. My father directed the movers like a general. My mother hovered. My sister moved through the rooms like she was already deciding what belonged to her. I carried my boxes into the master bedroom, the one we had agreed would be mine, and noticed how my sister avoided stepping inside. She stood in the doorway and looked around, her expression unreadable. That was the first time I felt the shift. Small comments followed. Jokes, really, about how big the room was, about how things might need to be adjusted later, about how basements were quiet and good for focus. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern I had been trained not to see. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself families needed time to settle. I told myself that being the successful one meant being flexible. What I didn't realize was that flexibility to my father meant obedience. The night of the dinner, he didn't ask, he announced. The shouting wasn't spontaneous. It was the last step in a plan that had been unfolding since the day we moved in. When I left the house that night, they thought I would come back. Apologetic. Reasonable. Ready to compromise my way back into a place they had already decided to take from me. Instead, I checked into a small hotel near the coast and slept for 8 uninterrupted hours. No footsteps above me. No tension in the walls. No unspoken expectations pressing down on my chest. In the morning, I woke up and did something I had never done before. I chose myself without explaining it to anyone. I called a real estate agent and told her I wanted a quiet house by the sea. Cash purchase. No delays. No complications. By noon, I was standing in a place that felt like air returning to my lungs. While I signed papers, my phone buzzed. Missed calls. Messages that shifted in tone from irritation to confusion to something closer to panic. I didn't answer. Silence, I learned, is only uncomfortable for the people who rely on your presence to function. I didn't know then how quickly things would unravel, or how a single clause buried in paperwork would change the balance of power entirely. I only knew that the night my father shouted was the night I stopped negotiating my worth. If this sounds familiar, if you've ever been told to shrink to keep the peace, stay with me. Follow this story to the end. And if you want more stories like this told honestly and without judgment, you know where to find the subscribe button. They thought they took my room that night. They didn't realize it was the moment they lost the house. The morning after my father shouted at me, I woke up without an alarm. That alone told me something had shifted. For months, my sleep had been shallow, broken by footsteps overhead, doors opening and closing, the constant awareness that I was living inside someone else's mood. That morning, in a quiet hotel room a few miles from the coast, there was nothing pressing on me. No expectations. No negotiations waiting in the kitchen. I lay there longer than I meant to, staring at the ceiling, replaying his words, not with anger, but with disbelief. Either you give your room to your sister, or get out of this house right now. The way he said it made one thing clear. He hadn't been asking for days. He had already decided. What struck me most was how familiar the pattern felt. Calm discussion, gentle pressure, moral framing. And when that didn't work, authority. I had seen it before. I just hadn't wanted to recognize it when it was aimed at me. 6 months earlier, none of this had seemed inevitable. When my father first called me about buying a house together, I was sitting in my office after a 12-hour day staring at spreadsheets and half-finished notes. He sounded unusually careful, as if he had rehearsed the conversation. He talked about timing, about how the market was right, about how it made sense for family to invest together instead of separately. Then my mother took the phone. She spoke softly, the way she always did when she wanted something she knew she shouldn't demand. She told me the house felt too big with just the two of them, that they worried about the future, that living together again might bring us closer now that we were all adults. She didn't mention money. She didn't have to. She knew I had it. I had spent 8 years building my business quietly without family support or applause. Long days, cautious decisions, learning the difference between risk and recklessness the hard way. By the time my parents started paying attention, the numbers were already there. Enough savings to make a significant move without debt. Enough stability to say no if I wanted to. And I did want to say no. I hesitated because I knew how quickly gratitude turned into expectation in my family. How easily help became obligation. How often my success had been treated not as something earned, but as something available. So I didn't say yes immediately. I asked questions. I listened carefully. I told them I would consider it. That's when my father made it sound reasonable. He said I wouldn't be helping them. We would be doing this together. A joint decision. A shared investment. Everyone would benefit. He spoke as if fairness was already built into the plan. I told him there was one condition. I would contribute nearly $1.5 million toward the purchase, but I needed the master bedroom on the ground floor. I didn't justify it with emotion. I explained it the way I explained everything else in my life. I worked from home. I needed privacy. I needed space that was clearly mine. I remember how quickly he agreed. Of course, he said. That makes sense. My mother smiled and nodded, adding that it was only fair given how much I was putting in. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand as if sealing a promise. My sister was there too, sitting quietly scrolling on her phone. She didn't argue. She didn't agree. She didn't say anything at all. At the time, I took that as neutrality. Looking back, it was something else entirely. The paperwork was handled by my father. He insisted on managing it, saying he had experience and connections and didn't want things to get complicated. I skimmed the documents more than I should have, not because I didn't understand them, but because I trusted the premise more than the details. Blood felt safer than fine print. That was my second mistake. The money was transferred in stages clean and documented. Escrow, closing timelines. Everything looked legitimate. I told myself this wasn't generosity. It was structure. It was smart. It was how adults handled shared assets. What I didn't see was how quickly my role was reframed. By the time the house was approved, my contribution had become background noise. The excitement focused on location layout, how my sister's life would improve. My name wasn't mentioned unless someone needed reassurance that the numbers worked. On moving day, I noticed it in small ways. The way my father directed movers without consulting me. The way my mother talked about rooms as if ownership were already settled. The way my sister drifted toward the master bedroom and then stopped hovering in the doorway like she was measuring something invisible. That first night after boxes were stacked and the house fell quiet, my father raised a glass and said this was a new beginning for all of us. My mother smiled like it was a blessing. My sister laughed and talked about how different everything felt. No one mentioned my condition. I told myself it was implied, that adults didn't need to restate agreements, that things would settle once the initial chaos passed. But agreements only matter when everyone benefits from remembering them. Within weeks, language began to shift. Temporary became flexible. Flexible became inconvenient. My success became a reason I should adapt, rather than a reason I deserved respect. I started hearing phrases that made my stomach tighten. You're strong. You don't need as much. You're already ahead in life. Your sister is under so much pressure. Pressure was the word they used whenever they wanted something from me. I noticed myself becoming quieter, choosing my words more carefully, letting comments pass that should have been challenged. It wasn't fear. It was habit. Years of being the reasonable one had taught me that peace was something you maintained by absorbing discomfort. What I didn't realize then was that peace built on silence always comes at a cost. The night my father shouted didn't come out of nowhere. It was the end of a slow, deliberate narrowing. By the time he raised his voice, the outcome had already been rehearsed in private conversations I wasn't invited into. Walking away from that dinner wasn't impulsive. It was the result of recognizing a pattern I had seen my entire life and finally deciding not to play my part in it anymore. That morning in the hotel room, as sunlight filtered through thin curtains, I understood something clearly for the first time. I hadn't agreed to buy a house with my family. I had agreed to test whether they could treat me as an equal. They failed long before my father ever raised his voice. By the third week, the house had learned my schedule. It knew when I woke up when I worked, when I retreated into my room and closed the door. It knew when I avoided the kitchen because my sister was there, when I waited for footsteps overhead to fade before moving through shared spaces. I had paid for walls and square footage, but what I was living in was tension measured in glances and pauses. The first conversation about my room happened on a Tuesday afternoon. My mother knocked softly the way she did when she wanted to appear gentle rather than decisive. She stepped inside without waiting for an answer, her eyes scanning the room as if it were already being evaluated. She commented on the light, the patio access, the quiet. Too good, really, for someone who worked all day and barely used it. She said my sister had been struggling. She said her studies were intense, that she needed stability, that she couldn't concentrate upstairs where noise traveled and heat collected. She said it casually, almost thoughtfully, as if she were sharing an observation rather than testing a boundary. I reminded her of the agreement. She smiled and said, of course, but circumstances change." That phrase followed me for days. My father brought it up next, framing it as practicality. He talked about fairness, about family sacrifice, about how my sister's future depended on the environment we created now. He never raised his voice then. He didn't need to. Authority was already built into his tone. I pointed out the obvious. There were 2 empty rooms upstairs. Bigger, brighter, closer to my sister's age and lifestyle. He shook his head, annoyed, as if I were missing something obvious. "She needs the best space to succeed," he said. "Not a good space. The best." When I didn't respond immediately, he added that I was adaptable, that I was already established, that I had options. Options, I learned, meant inconvenience for me. The basement was mentioned for the first time that night, almost as an afterthought. My mother said it had potential, that it could be renovated, that plenty of people lived happily in basements once they were finished. I went down there after dinner alone. The air was cooler, heavier, the ceiling lower, the windows narrow, placed high enough that you had to tilt your head back to see daylight. The concrete walls smelled faintly of dampness, no matter how clean they were kept. Pipes ran exposed along the ceiling like veins. I stood there longer than I wanted to admit, trying to imagine my life shrinking into that space. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no either. That indecision was interpreted as permission. Over the next week, the suggestion hardened into expectation. My sister started leaving her things in my room casually at first. A notebook on my desk, a sweater draped over a chair. She never asked. She smiled when I noticed, as if daring me to object. She talked loudly about how exhausted she was, how hard she was trying, how unfair it felt to be overlooked when everyone else was already settled. She never addressed me directly. Everything was aimed at the room. My parents listened. They sympathized. They agreed. One evening I came home to find the basement door open and a measuring tape stretched across the floor. My father was crouched near the wall taking notes. My mother stood beside him nodding. My sister hovered at the top of the stairs, arms crossed, watching me. "This is just planning," my mother said quickly. "Planning for what I asked." "For the future," my father replied. That was when I said it clearly. No. The word landed quietly, but it changed the air. My father straightened slowly. My mother's expression tightened. My sister rolled her eyes and laughed under her breath. That's when the tone shifted. "You're being selfish," my mother said, her voice thin with disappointment. My father didn't speak immediately. He looked at me the way he always had when he felt challenged, as if measuring how far he could push before resistance broke. He reminded me calmly that the house was in his name, that he handled the paperwork, that I lived there because he allowed it. I reminded him where the money came from. The room went silent. My sister smiled. That night I slept lightly, aware of every sound above me. Footsteps, laughter, doors closing. The house felt different, like a place where decisions were being made without me. The next morning my mother avoided my eyes. My sister was cheerful, humming as she made coffee in the kitchen I rarely used anymore. My father read the paper as if nothing had happened. By evening, my room felt smaller. Not physically, emotionally. I started noticing the way they talked about me when I wasn't in the room. Not insults, not directly, just assumptions. "She won't mind. She's reasonable. She understands how family works." Understanding in this house meant yielding. The pressure built quietly. No shouting, no ultimatums yet. Just the slow erosion of certainty. Every conversation framed as concern. Every objection reframed as stubbornness. I began packing my things mentally long before I touched a box. The dinner where my father finally raised his voice felt inevitable by then. The words he shouted were sharp, but they weren't new. They were simply the loud version of everything that had been said in softer tones for weeks. Either you give your room to your sister or get out right now. What stunned me wasn't the threat, it was the confidence behind it. He expected compliance, expected tears, expected negotiation. Instead, I stood up. I didn't argue. I didn't remind them of the money. I didn't ask for fairness or recognition. I picked up my bag, walked past the table, and left the house without another word. That silence followed me out the door. It stayed with me as I drove through unfamiliar streets past hotels and coastal signs I hadn't planned to notice. It stayed with me as I checked into a room I paid for myself with my own card under my own name. And it stayed with me as I realized something that should have been obvious much earlier. They had never expected me to leave. They had expected me to shrink. The first night away from the house was quieter than I expected. Not peaceful quiet in the way a paused room feels after an argument ends, but the tension hasn't dissipated yet. I lay on the hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, fully dressed shoes kicked off near the door, my phone face down on the nightstand like a truce I wasn't ready to negotiate. By midnight, there were 12 missed calls. All from my mother. No messages from my father. None from my sister. That absence spoke louder than anything my mother could have said. When I finally checked the voicemails the next morning, they followed a familiar progression. Confusion, concern, soft disappointment, gentle guilt. She said my father hadn't meant to shout, that emotions had been high, that my sister had cried all night, that the family felt fractured, and didn't I care about keeping things together? She never asked how I was. She never mentioned the basement. I didn't call back. Instead, I drove along the coast until the road opened up and the air changed. Salt replaced concrete. Space replaced walls. I pulled over near a quiet stretch of beach and sat in the car with the windows down, listening to waves crash with no agenda, no expectations. That was when the idea surfaced. Not revenge. Not yet. Just distance. I checked my bank app out of habit more than necessity. The numbers were steady, predictable, clean. Years of discipline reflected back at me in neat rows. I thought about the $1.5 million I had transferred months earlier, how casually it had been absorbed into my parents' sense of ownership. I thought about the documents I had skimmed, and then I thought about what I hadn't signed. The house my parents lived in carried my money, but not my name. That had felt like trust at the time. Now it felt like a blind spot. I booked another night at the hotel and called my assistant to reschedule meetings for the week. I needed time, not to panic, to see clearly. By the second day, the messages shifted. My sister texted me once. She wrote that she felt attacked, that she had never asked for my room-only fairness, that she was disappointed I'd walked out instead of talking things through like an adult. I read it twice. She hadn't asked. She had simply waited. My father finally called that evening. He didn't apologize. He asked where I was staying. I told him I was fine. He said we needed to talk about logistics, that walking out didn't change reality, that I couldn't abandon responsibilities just because I didn't like the outcome of a discussion. I asked him what responsibility he was referring to. He paused. The house, he said. The family arrangement. That was when something inside me went cold. Arrangement implied terms. Terms implied leverage. I ended the call politely and sat with that thought longer than was comfortable. That night, I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder where I kept copies of every major financial decision I'd made in the last decade. Contracts, transfers, agreements. I hadn't reviewed them in months, but the habit of documentation had never left me. The transfer to my parents stood out immediately. Clean, clear, one-directional. A contribution, not an investment. No ownership, no equity, no contingency. I stared at the numbers until my eyes blurred, then closed the laptop. That was the moment anger arrived, not loud or explosive, but sharp and precise. They hadn't just tried to move me into the basement. They had already decided I belonged there. The next morning, I called a real estate agent whose number I'd saved years ago and never used. She specialized in coastal properties, high-end, discreet, fast transactions. When she answered cheerful and efficient, I surprised myself by saying exactly what I wanted without hesitation. "I'm looking for a house by the sea," I said. "Something quiet, something mine." She asked about budget. I gave her a range that made her pause for half a second before recovering professionally. She asked about timing. "Immediately," I said. By afternoon, listings were in my inbox. Glass, stone, clean lines. Places built to withstand weather and time. No basements. No shared walls. No memories attached yet. As I scrolled, my phone buzzed again. My mother this time with urgency. She said my father was upset. That my sister was overwhelmed. That the house felt unstable without me there. That we needed to resolve things quickly before they escalated. Escalated to what I wondered. I didn't respond. Instead, I scheduled viewings. The first house I visited stood just far enough from the main road that the ocean felt like a constant presence rather than a backdrop. The agent talked about square footage and resale value, but I barely listened. I walked through empty rooms imagining silence, autonomy, choice. I pictured waking up without waiting for permission to move. That night, my father left a message that was less controlled. He said I was being dramatic, that leaving was irresponsible, that if I wanted to come back, we could discuss adjustments, but I couldn't expect everything to remain as it was. As it was, I thought. The following day, I made an offer. Cash, no contingencies. The agent didn't hide her surprise. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell my sister. I didn't even tell myself what this meant yet. I just knew one thing with absolute clarity. I was done negotiating my dignity in rooms I had paid for. The house by the sea wasn't a statement. It was an exit. And the moment the offer was accepted, I understood something else just as clearly. Walking away hadn't been the end of the story. It had been the opening move. The closing date came faster than I expected. I signed the documents in a quiet office that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and new paper, my name flowing easily across pages that did not require anyone else's permission. When the final signature dried, the agent slid the keys toward me with a professional smile that did not ask questions. I put them in my pocket and felt something settle in my chest. Not joy, not relief, control. I did not drive straight to the new house. I sat in my car for a long time with the engine off, staring at the keys resting in my palm. They were heavier than they looked. They represented something I had never fully allowed myself before, an exit that did not require approval. That evening, my mother called again. Her voice was tight, polite in the way people get when they are trying not to sound afraid. She asked when I was coming home. I said I wasn't sure. She said, "Your father needs clarity." I said I needed space. She paused, then said, "Space is a luxury we don't all get." That was when I realized they still believed I would return. The next morning I went back to the house. Not to stay, to observe. The air inside felt different now that I knew I had another place to go. I noticed details I had ignored before. The way the hallway narrowed toward the basement door. The way my sister's room upstairs had been subtly expanded since we moved in, furniture shifting outward like a claim. The way my parents' bedroom door remained closed, impenetrable. My father sat at the kitchen table reading the paper as if nothing had happened. My sister didn't look up from her phone. My mother watched me carefully as if measuring how much resistance I had left. They spoke to me kindly that morning. Too kindly. My mother asked if I'd slept well. My father asked about work. My sister offered me coffee without meeting my eyes. No one mentioned the argument. No one mentioned the basement. It was as if the night I walked out had been erased. Until my father said casually that since I'd been gone, they'd already moved some of my things downstairs to make better use of the space. I felt the shift before I felt the anger. He spoke as though it were practical, efficient, already decided. I asked which things. He waved a hand vaguely. Seasonal clothes, some boxes. Nothing important. My sister smiled then, small and quick. I walked to the basement without saying another word. The smell hit first, damp concrete and dust. The single bulb buzzed softly, casting uneven light across walls that had never been meant for living. My boxes were stacked against the far wall, neatly, methodically, reduced. I opened one at random. Inside were notebooks, old planners, documents from my first business, years of work condensed into cardboard and tape. They hadn't asked. They hadn't waited. They had assumed. When I came back upstairs, my mother followed me into the hallway. She said we need to talk. I said we already had. She said no, we need to talk calmly. She said your sister is under a lot of pressure. She said your father feels disrespected. She said families make sacrifices. She did not say sorry. I told her I had bought a house. The words landed heavily between us. Her face changed in a way I will never forget. Not shock. Calculation. She asked where. I said by the sea. She asked how soon I planned to move. I said immediately. She laughed softly as if I'd made a joke. She said you're being impulsive. She said running away doesn't solve anything. She said you can't just leave after everything we've done. That was when my father joined us. He asked what was going on. My mother told him. He looked at me with something close to disbelief. You bought a house without telling us, he said. I said yes. He asked how much. I said enough. He told me that was irresponsible. He told me families don't operate like that. He told me I was overreacting to a temporary arrangement. Temporary, I repeated. Yes, he said. Just until your sister finishes school. Just until things stabilize. I asked him how long that would be. He didn't answer. My sister finally spoke. She said I was making everyone uncomfortable. She said she never asked me to leave. She said she just needed the space more. She said you don't even use that room properly. I looked at her and saw something clear for the first time. This wasn't about space. It was about hierarchy. I told them I would be moving out within the week. My father raised his voice then. He said if I left, I shouldn't expect things to remain the same. I asked him to clarify. He said the house arrangement would need to be reevaluated. He said financial expectations would change. He said, don't assume you can just disappear and still be part of this family. That was the moment I understood the full scope of what I had been to them. Not a daughter, a buffer, a resource, a structure that absorbed pressure so they didn't have to. I packed that night. Only what mattered. Documents, clothes, personal items. I left the rest. When I carried the last box upstairs, my mother stood at the doorway and asked where I was going to put my things. I said somewhere dry. She didn't respond. The next morning, I drove to my new house. The ocean was loud and unapologetic. The walls were clean, the rooms empty and waiting. I placed my suitcase in the bedroom and sat on the floor with my back against the wall. For the first time since moving into my parents' house, I could breathe without listening for footsteps. That afternoon, my father called. He said we need to discuss the money. I asked which money. He said you know which. I said I did. And that was when I knew this story was no longer about where I lived. It was about what they thought they were entitled to, and what I was no longer willing to give. The first official night in my new house was strangely sleepless. Not because of fear or regret, but because silence can feel unfamiliar when you've spent years measuring your movements around other people's moods. The ocean outside my window moved steadily, indifferent to my thoughts. It didn't ask anything of me. It didn't need me to be quieter, smaller, more accommodating. That alone felt radical. I woke early, made coffee, and sat on the floor by the window watching light crawl across the walls. My phone buzzed twice before 9 a.m. My father. I let it ring. Then my mother. I silenced it. By noon, the messages started coming in clusters. My father's tone had shifted. No longer angry, strategic. He wanted to talk numbers. He wanted to clarify expectations. He wanted to understand what I thought I was doing. I didn't respond until late afternoon when the house had fully settled around me and my breathing had slowed enough to think clearly. I called him back. He didn't ask how the move went. He asked if I was planning to recover the money I'd contributed. The phrasing struck me. Recover implied theft. I reminded him that I hadn't asked for anything back. He said then, "Why are you behaving like this as a separation?" I said, "Because it is." He told me I was being dramatic again, that I was misinterpreting concern as control, that pushing my sister to the basement would have been unreasonable, and surely I could see that. I asked him why it was reasonable when it was me. He paused. Then he said it wasn't the same. That answer confirmed everything. Later that evening, my sister texted. She said Mom is crying. She said Dad is stressed. She said everyone feels like they're walking on eggshells because of me. I stared at the message for a long time, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I finally understood the pattern. Their discomfort was always framed as my responsibility. I replied once. I said, "I'm not responsible for managing your emotions." She didn't respond. 2 days later, my mother showed up unannounced. I watched her car pull into the driveway from the window, my stomach tightening despite myself. Old reflexes die hard. I considered not answering, but something told me this conversation needed to happen on my terms, not theirs. I opened the door. She looked around the house slowly, her eyes assessing everything at once. The space, the light, the view. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She said it's very... you. I asked her to sit. She didn't. She said your father is worried. She said your sister isn't sleeping. She said families don't fracture like this unless someone is being stubborn. I asked her who she thought that someone was. She sighed deeply, as if burdened by my question. She said you've always been sensitive. She said you take things personally. She said you're successful, yes, but emotionally reactive. I listened without interrupting. Then I asked her why no one had stopped my father from shouting at me during dinner. She said he was under pressure. I asked her why no one had defended me when my things were moved to the basement. She said it was temporary. I asked her why temporary solutions never seemed to involve my sister sacrificing anything. She didn't answer. Instead, she said, "Your sister needs stability." I said so did I. She looked genuinely surprised by that. She said you're an adult. I said exactly. That was when she said the thing she probably hadn't meant to say out loud. She said you don't need the room the way she does. You don't need us the way she does. There it was, the hierarchy spoken plainly. I told her that was precisely why I left. Her face hardened. She said if you walk away like this, don't expect things to go back to normal. I said I wasn't trying to go back. She asked what I wanted. I told her I wanted space without punishment. She said that's not how families work. I said then that's why this isn't working. She left shortly after without hugging me, without asking if I needed anything. That night my father sent a long email. It detailed expenses, repairs, upgrades. He itemized everything he believed my contribution had supported. He ended it by saying it would be unfair for me to benefit emotionally from leaving while they dealt with the consequences financially. That was when I realized this wasn't about reconciliation. It was about leverage. They believed distance was temporary. They believed I would feel guilty enough to negotiate. They believed I would eventually come back to the table. I forwarded the email to my lawyer. Not to escalate, to prepare. The next morning, I received a message from my sister that was different from the rest. She asked if I was really okay cutting everyone off like this. I replied that I hadn't cut anyone off. I had stepped away from being controlled. She said those were the same thing. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked down to the beach and let the cold water numb my feet. I thought about the $1.5 million I had handed over without a contract strong enough to protect my dignity. I thought about how quickly gratitude had turned into entitlement. I thought about how silence had been mistaken for compliance for years, and I understood something that changed everything. They weren't angry because I left. They were afraid because I had options. That afternoon, my lawyer called. He said we need to talk about the house. I asked him what he meant. He said there are details you should know, things you didn't sign, things that matter now. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall, the sound of the ocean steady behind me. And for the first time since I walked out, I felt something close to anticipation. Not fear, not regret. Clarity. Whatever was coming next, I would meet it standing in my own space, on my own terms. My lawyer asked me to send everything, not just the transfer receipts or the closing documents for the house my parents lived in, but every email, every text, every message that mentioned conditions, expectations, or agreements. He wanted timelines. He wanted tone. He wanted context. So I sat at my dining table overlooking the ocean and began laying my life out in folders. There was the original transfer confirmation. $1.5 million sent in 3 clean installments, each labeled clearly as a contribution toward the purchase. No loan terms, no repayment schedule, no ownership stake. I had trusted intent more than structure. Then there were the emails. My father's early messages were warm, enthusiastic, almost flattering. He talked about partnership, about how proud he was that I could help the family this way. My mother followed with gratitude wrapped in reassurance. Everything was fair. Everything was agreed. Everything was settled. And then there were the silences. Weeks where nothing was written down because nothing was supposed to change. Until it did. My lawyer pointed it out gently when we met later that afternoon over a video call. He was calm, precise, the kind of man who never raised his voice because he didn't need to. He said, "You never transferred ownership." I said I knew. He said, "You never signed an occupancy waiver." I said I didn't know that mattered. He nodded. "It matters now." He explained it slowly, carefully, making sure I understood each step. The money I contributed was documented as conditional support tied to a specific living arrangement, not legally framed as rent, not framed as a gift without expectation. It was attached to occupancy, to use, to residence. When you left, he said that condition changed. I asked him what that meant. He said it meant the structure holding that house together was no longer balanced. My parents, it turned out, had assumed my money was unconditional because I was family. They had never bothered to formalize protections for themselves. They had rushed through documents confident that blood would do the work contracts usually handled. They didn't read the fine print. They didn't think they needed to. The clause had been included by the escrow firm as a standard protection for large non-equity contributions. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't hidden. It simply stated that continued support was contingent on continued residence under agreed terms. When those terms were violated, support could be reevaluated. I felt something loosen in my chest. Not triumph. Recognition. This wasn't a trap I had set. It was a safeguard I hadn't even realized I still had. My lawyer asked me what I wanted to do. The question surprised me. I said I didn't want revenge. He said that's good because revenge complicates things. He asked if I wanted to reassert occupancy rights. I said no. He asked if I wanted to pursue repayment. I hesitated. Then I said I wanted clarity. He smiled slightly. Clarity, he said, is enforceable. The next steps didn't involve confrontation. They involved paperwork, notifications, letters written in language that did not argue or accuse, just stated facts. A formal notice was prepared and sent to my parents outlining the change in conditions triggered by my departure. It explained the financial implications in plain terms. Deadlines, options, responsibilities, no threats, no ultimatums, just consequences. I didn't read the final version more than once. I didn't need to. I trusted the process the way I once trusted my family. That night I slept deeply for the first time since moving into my new house. The next morning, my phone exploded. My mother called first, then my father, then my sister. I let it ring. By noon, the messages had shifted from confusion to panic. My mother asked what this letter meant. She said it must be a mistake. She said we needed to talk immediately. My father left a voicemail that was clipped, controlled, and edged with anger. He said involving lawyers was unnecessary. He said this was a family matter. He said I was escalating things beyond reason. My sister sent a single message. "What did you do?" I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I went for a walk along the shore, the sand cold under my feet, the sky low and gray. I thought about how often I had been told I was overreacting, too sensitive, too dramatic, and how quiet the world felt now that I had stopped reacting at all. That afternoon, my lawyer forwarded me a reply from my father's attorney. The tone was defensive, dismissive. It argued intent, family understanding, emotional context. My lawyer replied with dates, clauses, signatures. The conversation changed immediately. Within 48 hours, my parents understood the scope of the situation. The house they lived in was no longer stable under its current arrangement. Without my continued contribution, costs rose sharply. Obligations tightened. Options narrowed. The reality they had ignored arrived all at once. My mother called again, her voice thin and unfamiliar. She asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. I told her I had. She asked why I didn't warn them. I told her I didn't know I needed to protect myself from my own family. She cried. I stayed quiet. My father tried a different approach. He asked to meet. He said we could work something out privately. He said there was no need for all this formality. I said the letter explained everything clearly. He said you don't understand what you're doing. I said I understood exactly. My sister sent another message that night. She said this was going too far. She said you're ruining everything. I read it once, then put the phone down. For the first time, I saw the full shape of what had happened. They hadn't lost control because I was cruel. They had lost control because I had stepped out of the role that made their version of family possible. The house had been built on assumptions, on silence, on my willingness to absorb discomfort so everyone else could feel stable. Now that structure was cracking, and there was nothing I needed to do to make it happen. It was already in motion. All I had done was walk away, and that, it turned out, was enough. The envelope arrived early in the morning, slid halfway under my front door like it had been measured to stop right there. White, unmarked, heavy enough that I knew it wasn't a bill or a notice meant to be ignored. I picked it up, felt the thickness of the paper inside, and already understood what it was before I opened it. Confirmation. I made coffee first. That felt important. I sat at the table facing the ocean, steam rising from the mug, and opened the envelope without urgency. The language was clean, neutral, almost kind in its precision. No accusations, no moral judgments, just statements. A change in conditions had been formally recognized. The clause tied to my financial contribution had been triggered. Timelines were now active. I read it once, then again, slower. Nothing in it surprised me. When I had first sent the documents to my lawyer, I hadn't been hoping for leverage. I had been hoping for clarity. This letter was clarity reduced to black ink and margins. The clause itself was simple. My contribution toward the house was contingent upon continued residence under the agreed terms. If those terms were violated, or if I no longer resided there, the financial structure would be reassessed. It had never been punishment. It had been protection. I thought about how quickly my father had rushed me through the paperwork. How often he'd said we didn't need to read every page. How he'd laughed and said lawyers complicate things when families should trust each other. Trust, it turned out, had never been mutual. By mid-morning, I knew my parents had received their copies. I didn't need confirmation. I could imagine the moment with unsettling clarity. My mother opening the envelope at the kitchen counter. My father scanning the first page too quickly, dismissing it as technical language meant to intimidate. The pause when he reached the section with deadlines. the way his jaw would tighten when he realized this wasn't something he could talk his way out of. The first call came an hour later. My mother's number lit up my screen. I let it ring. The second call followed immediately, then a text. "Please call me. We don't understand what this means." I didn't respond. I knew better than to explain something that was already written in plain English. Explanation invited negotiation. Negotiation was exactly what this process removed. By noon, my father tried. His message was shorter. "We need to discuss this. Now." I deleted it. The house they lived in had stopped being a family space the moment they decided my room was expendable. Now it was just what it had always been underneath the sentiment: a financial structure. And structures don't respond to emotion. I went for a walk along the beach that afternoon, letting the wind cut through the last of the tension that had lived in my shoulders for months. Every step felt lighter than the last. Not because I was enjoying their panic, but because I no longer felt responsible for absorbing it. When I returned home, there were more messages waiting. My mother's tone had shifted. No longer confused, alarmed now. She asked what they were supposed to do. She asked how long they had. She asked why I hadn't warned them. I stared at the screen and felt something close to sadness. I had warned them. Every time I restated my boundary. Every time I reminded them of the agreement. Every time I said no. They just hadn't listened. My father left a voicemail that evening. His voice was controlled, but the strain was unmistakable. He said this clause was never discussed. He said this was an overreach. He said no reasonable person would interpret a family contribution this way. What he didn't say was that he had signed the documents. What he didn't say was that he had assumed authority replaced accountability. The deadline was clear: a specific number of days to either meet revised financial obligations or initiate corrective action. There was no ambiguity, no appeal to fairness, just math and time. I marked the date on my calendar and closed it. That night I slept with the windows open. The sound of the ocean filled the room steady and indifferent. It reminded me that systems far larger than family drama existed, and they did not bend to entitlement. The next morning, my sister finally reached out. Her message was short and frantic. "What is happening? Dad says the house is in trouble." I didn't reply. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because she had always known how things worked in that house. She had simply benefited from it. By the third day, the calls became more desperate. My mother cried openly now. She said they were being punished unfairly. She said this was destroying the family. She said I was letting something small spiral out of control. Small. A basement room. A shouted ultimatum. $1.5 million treated like leverage instead of trust. I understood then that they still believed this was about emotions. About pride. About winning. They hadn't grasped the shift. This wasn't personal anymore. This was procedural. Professionals were involved now. Advisors, legal counsel, people who didn't care who slept where or who had raised whom. They cared about numbers lining up and obligations being met. The house, I realized, was already slipping away from them. Not because I wanted it to, but because it could no longer sustain the fantasy it had been built on. I made dinner that night and ate it alone at my table, watching the sky darken over the water. My phone buzzed again, and this time I answered. It was my father. He didn't yell. He asked if we could meet. I told him there was nothing to discuss that wasn't already in writing. He asked if I understood what this would lead to. I said I understood perfectly. He went quiet. Then he said almost to himself, "We never thought you'd actually leave." I closed my eyes. "Neither did I," I said. The call ended without resolution. I sat there long after thinking about how easily love had been confused with access, how often silence had been mistaken for consent. The letter had not threatened them. It had informed them. And that I knew was the moment everything truly changed. They still believed there was room to argue. There wasn't. The clock had started. and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one waiting. The knock came just after sunset, firm and deliberate, the kind that assumes the door will open. I was rinsing a glass at the sink when I heard it, the ocean still murmuring beyond the windows like nothing in the world had changed. I didn't rush. I dried my hands, checked the latch out of habit, and walked to the door knowing exactly who would be on the other side. They stood close together on the porch, framed by the fading light. My father, first shoulders squared, jaw tight. My mother half a step behind him, lips pressed thin as if holding herself together. No sister. She was never sent to do the asking. For a moment, no one spoke. Then my father cleared his throat and said my name as if saying it correctly might restore something he'd lost. I didn't invite them in. The sea breeze moved between us, lifting my mother's hair, tugging at the edges of my father's jacket. I could see the strain in them now, the fatigue that comes from carrying a story too long after it stops working. "We got your letter," my mother said finally. I nodded. My father shifted his weight, already irritated by the simplicity of the response. He said we need to talk about what this means. "It means what it says," I replied. He frowned as if I'd missed the point. He said this isn't how families handle disagreements. He said lawyers escalate things. He said you didn't have to go this far. I leaned against the doorframe and waited for him to finish. My mother tried next. Her voice softened, careful and pleading. She said we're confused. She said we never agreed to anything like this. She said you know how your father is with paperwork. I looked at her and felt something close to pity. Not because she was helpless, but because she was still pretending confusion could undo consent. "You signed it," I said. "Both of you." My father's face darkened. He said, "You know we trusted you." He said we never imagined you'd turn something like this against us. "Against you," I repeated. He raised his voice, not shouting yet, but close. He said you walked out. You broke the arrangement. You can't punish us for reacting. I corrected him calmly. I said the arrangement broke when my room was taken, when my things were moved, when I was told to choose between obedience and exile. My mother winced at the word. She said you could have come back. She said we could have talked it through. I asked her when. She didn't answer. My father tried to reclaim the ground. He said this clause is unreasonable. He said no judge would enforce something like this against parents. He said it was never meant to apply to us. It applies to circumstances, I said, not people. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that exposes the gap between expectation and reality. I could see it landing on them, the understanding that there was no argument left that didn't sound like pleading. My mother asked what happens now. I told her I didn't know. I told her professionals were handling it. My father scoffed. He said you always hide behind professionals when things get uncomfortable. I smiled, small and controlled. I said I learned that from you. That was when his temper finally broke through the restraint. He said you owe us. He said after everything we did for you, this is how you repay us. I interrupted him. I said I paid. More than once. In ways you were happy to accept until I stopped being useful. The words didn't sting the way shouting would have. They landed cleanly undeniable. My mother's eyes filled with tears. She said we're scared. I believed her. Fear had replaced entitlement, and it didn't sit well on either of them. My father asked if there was anything I could do. Anything at all. He said surely I didn't want your own parents struggling because of a misunderstanding. I shook my head slowly. I said I wasn't intervening. I said that would only make things worse. He stared at me, stunned. He said you'd really let this happen. I met his eyes and said, I'm letting what already started finish. He took a step forward, and I stepped back just enough to keep the threshold clear. The boundary was physical now, unmistakable. My mother noticed. She reached for his arm, whispering something I couldn't hear. He shook her off, frustrated and exhausted. This isn't over, he said, his voice lower now. I nodded. I said no. It's just understood now. The ocean surged behind me, a steady punctuation to the moment. I could feel the house at my back, solid and quiet, holding its ground without needing to prove anything. My mother asked if we could come inside. Just for a minute. I hesitated, then said no. Not unkindly, not defensively, just no. She closed her eyes as if that word carried more weight than anything else that had been said. I told them I wished them well. I told them I hoped they found a solution that worked for everyone. My father laughed once, bitter and sharp. He said you always did know how to sound reasonable while cutting people off. I said I learned that too. They turned and walked back toward their car, their silhouettes shrinking as the light disappeared completely. I watched until the engine started, until the taillights vanished down the road. When the porch was empty again, I closed the door. The sound was soft. Final without being dramatic. I stood there for a long moment, listening to my own breathing, noticing how steady it felt. No rush of triumph, no wave of guilt, just the quiet recognition that something irreversible had happened and I had survived it intact. I went back to the kitchen, poured myself another glass of water, and sat at the table facing the dark water outside. They would tell their version of this story. They would say I was cold, calculated, unforgiving. What they would never say was that they came to my door expecting control and left understanding they had none. The house would still have to be dealt with. The deadlines would still arrive. Consequences would continue unfolding whether anyone liked them or not. But the moment they knocked, and I didn't step aside, something fundamental shifted. I wasn't waiting anymore. And for the first time, neither were they. The news didn't come from my parents. It came from a third party which told me everything I needed to know about how far things had fallen. My lawyer forwarded a short update early in the morning, factual and unemotional. Deadlines had been missed. Revised obligations had not been met. The situation had moved into the next phase. I read it once and closed my laptop. Outside, the sea was restless gray and loud, the kind of morning that made everything feel exposed. I wrapped my hands around a mug of coffee and stood at the window thinking about how quickly confidence evaporates when it's no longer supported by numbers. By midday, the reality had reached them. My mother left a voicemail, her voice strained and uneven. She said the bank was asking questions. She said advisors were involved now. She said things were getting complicated. Complicated was her word for consequences. She didn't mention the clause. She didn't mention the letter. She didn't mention the fact that every warning had arrived in writing and been ignored. She spoke as if events were simply happening to them, sudden and unfair like weather. My father followed with an email that tried to sound composed. He wrote about cash flow, about short-term adjustments, about temporary measures while they explored options. He asked carefully if I would consider delaying anything just to give them time to stabilize. He didn't ask me to come home. He didn't apologize. He asked me to pause gravity. I didn't reply. The truth was already clear. Without my continued financial support, the house they lived in had become unsustainable. Payments increased. Flexibility disappeared. The margin they had relied on quietly and without acknowledgement was gone. The house that had once been presented as a symbol of family unity was now just a liability with walls. I learned the rest in fragments. A real estate agent had been contacted. Not the kind you call when you're exploring possibilities, but the kind you call when you need options fast. The listing wasn't public yet, but it would be soon. The price would be lower than they'd expected. Urgency does that. My sister called that evening. It was the first time she'd called instead of texted since everything began, and I could hear panic under her words before she tried to cover it with anger. She asked why no one had told her things were this bad. She said she thought the house was safe. She said she didn't understand how it could all unravel so quickly. I told her it hadn't unraveled quickly. It had unraveled quietly long before anyone paid attention. She said this isn't fair. I said fairness depends on where you're standing. She accused me of abandoning them when they needed me most. She said I could fix this if I wanted to. I said that was exactly the problem. The call ended without resolution, her breathing sharp and uneven, mine steady in contrast. The next update came 2 days later. The house was officially listed. Seeing it in writing felt surreal. The same walls I'd walked through carrying boxes, the same rooms where my boundaries had been negotiated away, were now described in neutral language. Square footage, natural light, potential. No mention of who had slept where. No mention of who had paid what. No mention of shouting at dinner or boxes moved to basements. Just property. I felt no satisfaction reading it, only a quiet sense of inevitability. My father tried one last time. He showed up unannounced at my office, catching me between meetings. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way men do when their authority has been replaced by urgency. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand anything. He asked if we could talk privately. We sat in a conference room with glass walls visible from every angle. He noticed that. It unsettled him. He said this was getting out of hand. He said your mother is barely holding it together. He said your sister doesn't know where she'll end up. I listened. Then I told him I wasn't intervening. He stared at me as if I'd spoken another language. He said, "You're really going to let strangers decide our future?" I said that future had been decided the moment my contribution stopped being respected. He said, "You're punishing us." I said, "No. I'm refusing to rescue you from choices you were comfortable making when they didn't affect you." That was when his voice cracked. He said, "I never thought you'd do this." I said, "Neither did I." He left shortly after shoulders slumped, the door closing softly behind him. I watched through the glass as he walked down the hallway past people who didn't know him, didn't owe him, didn't bend around his expectations. That night I thought about favoritism. Not as cruelty, but as avoidance. How it shields one child from responsibility by transferring weight onto another. How it feels like love until the structure collapses and everyone realizes the support beams were uneven. My sister had been protected. I had been expected to endure. Now the cost of that imbalance was being calculated line by line. The house stayed on the market longer than they hoped. Offers came in below asking. Conditions tightened. Repairs that had been postponed suddenly mattered. Every compromise reduced the story they told themselves about what the house was worth. It wasn't just the building. It was the illusion. I didn't celebrate. I didn't monitor the listing obsessively. I went about my life, cooked meals in my own kitchen, slept without interruption, worked without carrying anyone else's anxiety on my back. When the message finally came that a deal was likely, I felt something unexpected. Not relief. Release. The chapter of my life that had required me to be the stabilizer was closing. Not because I had slammed a door, but because I had stopped holding one open. Favoritism. I realized always sends the bill somewhere. Sometimes it takes years to arrive. Sometimes it arrives all at once. By the time the house went under contract, my role in the outcome was already complete. I hadn't demanded justice. I hadn't orchestrated collapse. I had simply stepped out of the pattern. And once I did, the cost of everything they'd taken for granted became impossible to ignore. The house would be sold. The numbers would settle. Life would move on in a shape none of them had planned for. And for the first time, that shape no longer included me as the foundation holding everything up. After the house went under contract, the noise stopped. Not immediately, but gradually, like a machine powering down after years of running too hot. The calls slowed. The messages shortened. Even the silences changed, no longer heavy with expectation, just empty. I noticed it one morning while making breakfast, standing barefoot on cool tile, the ocean light spilling across the counter. I reached for my phone out of habit and realized there was nothing to brace for. No emergencies waiting to be managed. No moods to anticipate. No damage to contain. The quiet felt earned. For a long time, I had believed that distance would feel like punishment, that stepping back would hollow something out inside me. Instead, it revealed how much space had been taken up by tension I had normalized. I thought about the version of myself who had moved back into my parents' house, believing adulthood meant compromise at any cost. She had been careful, strategic, willing to shrink if it kept things calm. She had confused endurance with maturity. What changed wasn't my love for them. It was my understanding of what love should cost. There was grief in that realization, and I didn't pretend otherwise. I mourned the family I thought I had, the version of my parents who might have chosen differently if they'd been braver, the sister who might have learned responsibility instead of entitlement. Grief doesn't always arrive as tears. Sometimes it shows up as clarity that can't be undone. I replayed moments from the past with new context, the way my needs were always postponed, the way praise came when I was useful and concern appeared only when I resisted, the subtle training that taught me to earn belonging instead of expecting it. None of it had been dramatic. That was the most dangerous part. It had all been reasonable. I understood then why walking away felt like betrayal to them. My compliance had been a pillar they leaned on without noticing. Removing it didn't feel like a boundary. It felt like an attack. But boundaries aren't about punishment. They're about definition. I didn't cut my family off in anger. I didn't shut doors to make a point. I simply stopped participating in a dynamic that required me to disappear to function. That distinction mattered to me. There were nights when guilt tried to creep back in, usually when I was tired or alone. It sounded like my mother's voice asking if this was really necessary, like my father's certainty that I was overreacting, like my sister's frustration that things hadn't gone her way. I let those thoughts pass without engaging them. I had learned something important about guilt. It thrives on silence, but it dissolves under examination. Every time I traced the sequence of events honestly, the outcome remained the same. I had stated my boundary. It had been ignored. I had removed myself. The system collapsed because it had been unbalanced long before I touched it. That wasn't cruelty. It was cause and effect. I didn't hate them. That surprised me most of all. I felt no urge to gloat, no satisfaction in their struggle. What I felt was distance, clean and intentional. Distance gave me perspective. I could see my father clearly now, a man who equated control with care, who believed authority excused listening. I could see my mother's quiet compliance, the way she smoothed over harm in the name of harmony, asking others to absorb discomfort so she wouldn't have to confront it. And my sister raised inside that system, protected from consequence and unprepared for reality. Understanding them didn't obligate me to return. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned off quickly once I stopped arguing with reality. What remained was resolve. I set boundaries that were simple and firm: limited contact, no financial entanglement, no private negotiations, no revisiting decisions that had already been made. When messages came, I responded politely or not at all. I didn't explain myself again. Explanation had never brought understanding, only delay. I noticed how my body responded to this new normal. Shoulders lower, breathing deeper, sleep uninterrupted, decisions made without rehearsing how they would be received. I wasn't harder, I was clearer. One afternoon I unpacked the last box from the move. It held old notebooks, margins filled with ideas and plans from the early days of my business. I flipped through them slowly, recognizing the voice of someone who had trusted herself before learning to doubt. I placed them on a shelf by the window where the light could reach them. Outside, the ocean moved the way it always did, unconcerned with my history. It reminded me that stability doesn't come from holding things together by force. It comes from alignment. I thought about the word revenge and realized it never fit what had happened. Revenge is active, consuming. It requires fixation on the people who wronged you. What I had done was quieter. I had chosen not to intervene. The consequences followed on their own. If anything, the hardest part was accepting that there would be no moment of acknowledgement, no apology that matched the damage, no admission that my leaving had been necessary. Closure. I learned isn't something other people give you. It's something you stop asking for. There were still days when I missed the idea of family gatherings, shared history, the comfort of familiarity. But I didn't miss the version of myself who paid for belonging with silence. That trade no longer made sense. Standing at the window one evening watching the horizon darken, I felt something settle that had nothing to do with victory. Peace, I realized, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives when you stop negotiating your worth. I hadn't destroyed my family. I had stepped out of a role that required me to disappear. And in doing so, I found something I hadn't known I was missing: myself. The morning everything finally felt finished, I woke up before sunrise. Not because of anxiety or habit, but because my body no longer needed to brace itself. The house was quiet in a way that felt intentional, not temporary. I walked barefoot across the floor, opened the windows, and let the sound of the ocean move through the rooms without interruption. There were no messages waiting on my phone, no updates from lawyers, no emergencies disguised as conversations, no expectations hiding inside silence. That was how I knew it was over. For a long time, I had thought the end would feel dramatic, a clear victory, a final confrontation, some moment where the truth landed loudly enough to echo. Instead, it arrived as calm. I made coffee and sat at the table watching the light change on the water. The house didn't feel empty. It felt complete. Every corner belonged to me, not because I had claimed it loudly, but because I no longer shared space with resentment. I thought about the word loss. People would say I lost my family, that I chose money over blood, that I walked away when things got difficult. What they wouldn't see was how long I had been walking toward that door before I ever opened it. I hadn't lost my family in one moment. I had been losing myself slowly every time I was asked to be smaller so someone else could feel bigger. Every time my needs were labeled unreasonable, while my sisters were treated as urgent. Every time silence was praised as maturity. Walking away didn't create the distance. It revealed it. I didn't wake up one day angry enough to leave. I woke up one day clear enough to stop staying. That difference matters. There was a version of me who believed love meant endurance, that loyalty meant flexibility without limits, that being strong meant absorbing discomfort so others wouldn't have to face it. She wasn't weak. She was misinformed. Boundaries didn't turn me cold. They turned me honest. I didn't stop caring about my parents or my sister. I stopped sacrificing myself to keep a system intact that only worked when I disappeared inside it. And yes, there was grief in that. I grieved the parents I wished I had, the conversations that would never happen, the apology that would never arrive in the form I deserved. I grieved the idea that if I just explained myself one more time, things might finally change. Letting go of that hope was painful. But it was also freeing, because hope, when it's misplaced, can trap you longer than fear ever will. What surprised me most was how little resentment I carried once I stopped arguing with reality. Anger needs friction to survive. When you step out of the cycle, it burns out on its own. What replaced it wasn't forgiveness. It was perspective. I could see my parents clearly now, not as villains, but as people who confused control with care. I could see my sister not as an enemy, but as someone shaped by favoritism she never had to question. Understanding them didn't require excusing them. And it didn't require me to return. The most important thing I learned through all of this was simple and uncomfortable. Walking away is not abandonment when staying requires self-erasure. I didn't leave to teach them a lesson. I left because I finally understood my worth. That realization didn't come with applause. It came with quiet mornings, with decisions made without rehearsing explanations, with peace that didn't need witnesses. Some evenings I still stand by the window and watch the horizon darken, thinking about how easily I once gave away access to my life in exchange for approval. How often I confused being needed with being valued. I don't make that mistake anymore. If you're listening to this and something in your chest tightened along the way, you're not imagining it. Maybe you've been the reasonable one, The flexible one, the one who keeps things together at personal cost. Maybe you've been told that asking for space is selfish, that boundaries are punishments, that walking away means you didn't try hard enough. I tried, and then I chose myself. If you've ever faced a moment like that, I'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments, even if it's something you've never said out loud before. Sometimes naming it is the first step toward reclaiming yourself. And if you want to stay with this channel for more stories like this, stories about family boundaries and finding strength where you were taught to feel guilty, you're welcome here. Subscribe if this resonated with you and stay a while. I didn't lose a family, I found my life. And that finally was enough.